preservation. Our reducing poverty was the central objective social of programs during the reform period. Policymakers and legislators hoped for a variety of good things from the war on poverty and OEO, the entitlements, and the widening population of eligible recipients. But whatever else the programs were to accomplish, they were to put more money in the hands of poor people. They were to reduce poverty. The story of what happened to poverty in the years after the reforms took effect, in comparison with what was happening earlier, epitomizes the history of the other indicators we will be examining. The figures do not make sense on their own. Just as the figures on unemployment, labor force participation, education, crime, and the family will not make sense. The numbers go the wrong way at the wrong time. The popular conception about poverty is that, at least on this one fundamental goal, the Great Society brought progress. The most widely shared view of history has it that the United States entered the 1960s with a large population of poor people, Harrington's Other America, who had been bypassed by the prosperity of the Eisenhower years. The rich and the middle class had gained, but the poor had not. Then, after fits and starts during the Kennedy years, came the explosion of programs under Johnson. These programs were perhaps too ambitious, it is widely conceded, and perhaps the efforts were too helter-skelter. But most people seem to in poverty. Vision a plot in which dramatic improvement did not really get started until the programs of the Great Society took effect. The reality is that improvement was stopping, not starting, during that time. The nature of the puzzle to be explored for the next 6 chapters is shown for the case of poverty in Figure 4.1. The definition of poverty is the official one, based on cash income. An extended discussion of the nature of the official poverty measure may be found in the notes. The line labeled dollars refers to the amount of cash for the needy given out by the federal government. Poverty did fall during the 5 Johnson years, from 18% of the population in 1964 to 13% in 1968, his last year in office, and the slope of the decrease was the steepest during this period. But the rest of the graph showing poverty before 1964 and after 1968 reveals the fallacy in the popular conception of historical cause and effect. Data and source information, Appendix Table 3 and Appendix Table 5. Being poor, being black, 1950 to 1980. In the first place, as noted in Chapter 3, the Great Society reforms had very limited budgets through the Johnson administration. The real annual expenditures of the 1970s were far larger by many orders of magnitude, for some of the programs, than expenditures in the 60s. Yet progress against poverty stopped in the 70s. The steep declines in poverty from 1964 to 1968 cannot glibly be linked with government anti-poverty dollar expenditures. Secondly, the declines in poverty prior to 1964 were substantial. In 1950, the first year shown in Figure 4.1, poverty had stood at approximately 30% of the population. From there, it declined to the 18% of Johnson's first year. The size of the officially impoverished population dropped by about 17 percentage points in the years from 1950 to 1968, of which the Johnson years accounted for 5, about their fair share. 4. Then, after 2 decades of reasonably steady progress, improvement slowed in the late 60s and stopped altogether in the 70s. The proportion dipped to its low point, 11%, in 1973. A higher proportion of the American population was officially poor in 1980 than at any time since 1967. By then it stood at 13% and was heading up. The number of people living in poverty stopped declining just as the public assistance program budgets and the rate of increase in those budgets were highest. The question is why this should be. If we were asking about progress in reducing a problem like chronic unemployment, explanations would be easier. Fixing the last 10% of a problem is often more difficult than fixing the first 90% of it. But poverty, as officially defined, is a matter of cash in hand from whatever source. The recipient of the benefits does not have to do anything, does not have to change behavior or values, does not have to qualify in any way except to be a recipient. To eliminate such poverty, All we need do is mail enough checks with enough money to enough people. In the late 60s, still more in the 70s, the number of checks, the size of the checks, and the number of beneficiaries all increased. Yet, perversely, poverty chose those years to halt a decline that had been underway for 2 decades. Of course, progress stopped. The economy went bad. The explanation that comes first to mind is that the bright hopes of the 60s dimmed in the 70s as the economy slowed. According to this view, inflation and the dislocations brought on by the Vietnam War, along poverty, with a revolution in energy prices, hobbled the economy. As the expansionist environment of the 60s vanished, strategies and programs of the war on poverty had to be put aside. What, if anything, do the data suggest about the merits of this economic explanation? Let us take the simplest, most widely used measure of the state of the economy, growth in GNP, and examine its relation to changes in the number of people living in poverty. The answer, despite the ridicule heaped on trickle-down as a way to help the poor, is that changes in GNP have a very strong inverse relation to changes in poverty. As GNP increases, poverty decreases. But we cannot use this relationship to explain why we stopped making progress against poverty in the 1970s. Economic growth during the 1970s was actually greater than during the peacetime 1950s, memories of Eisenhower prosperity notwithstanding. The average annual growth rate from 1953 to 1959 was 2.7%, noticeably lower than the average annual growth of 3.2% from 1970 to 1979.5. Moreover, the lower growth of the 70s took the form of a few very bad years. During those years that had growth rates as high as those of the palmy days of the 1960s, the trend lines on poverty should have behaved as they did during the comparable growth years of the 50s and 60s. But they did not. 6. Upon consideration, it will also be apparent that in important ways the 1970s were even richer than the percentage increases in GNP indicate, because the base for calculating the percentage increase kept getting larger. The real dollar increase in GNP during the 1970s was half again as large as in the 1950s. This sizable increase holds up when we also control for population change. Figure 4.2 shows a second aspect of the poverty paradox, the way that poverty quit dropping while per capita GNP continued to grow, even after holding both population change and inflation constant. Per capita GNP increased only a little less rapidly in the 70s than it had in the booming 60s, and much faster than during the 50s. Growth did not stop. But for some reason, the benefits of economic growth stopped trickling down to the poor. This book is about social policy as it affects the working-aged and their children. Social policy for the elderly is a completely different topic. D. Poverty and Economic Growth, 1950 to 1980. Data and Source Information, Appendix Tables 1 and 3 and Appendix Table 5. Note, breaks in the poverty line indicate revisions in the method of calculation, demanding a full treatment of its own. But the population of retirement-aged persons provides a plausible explanation for the poverty paradoxes. The hypothesis is that, as the proportion of elderly in the population increased from 9.9% in 1970 to 11.3% in 1980, the number of people dependent on government help inevitably increased as well, and it is this which explains the flattening trend lines in the 70s. The income transfers worked as planned, according to this line of argument, but their effectiveness among the working-aged population was masked by the increasing amounts of money that were going to retired persons with no other income except government payments. The validity of the hypothesis is easily checked. The poverty statistics for 1959 and for 1966 to 80 include separate figures for the elderly. I use these to calculate official poverty among the working-aged. The results are shown in Figure 4.3. Eliminating the elderly only accentuates the trends we have examined. Progress against poverty stopped sooner and more completely for the working age than for the population as a whole. Progress among the under 65s did not just begin to slow in the late 60s, it effectively hit bottom. Progress didn't really stop, blacks kept gaining. Even if poverty had stopped decreasing among the population as a whole, there is reason, given the logic of the structuralist school of poverty, that poverty among blacks might have continued to drop nonetheless. Suppose that racial discrimination had created a segmented labor market and otherwise kept poor blacks from sharing in the bounty of a growing economy. If so, then the black population as of the late 1960s would have included a large proportion of poor people who were trapped in poverty despite the economic boom. In that case, white reductions in poverty might track with economic growth, but black reductions would be contingent on the income transfers, jobs programs, and other special measures that moved into high gear in the 70s. Let us compare this possibility with what actually happened to working-age blacks in Figure 4.4. As the figure indicates, black progress did not continue into the 70s. It stopped very much as white progress stopped. But it does provide, vividly, the reason why many still remember the Great Society fondly. Imagine that you were shown the graph a few months after Lyndon Johnson had left office in 1969. The impulse to credit the government programs would have been almost irresistible. In 1959, 58% of working-aged blacks were below the poverty line. A single decade later, the percentage was 30%, a precipitous drop of 28 percentage points in 10 years. Blacks did indeed make economic progress in the 60s, huge progress for such a short period of time. But we are not examining the graph as it looked in 1969. We are seeing it with the experience of the 70s tacked on, and our perspective on the 60s has changed accordingly. We know that in 1969, funding of the programs that were then being given credit for the progress was still relatively low compared with later years. We are more aware that greatest progress occurred in 1963, 1964, 1965, and 1966, when the reforms were little more than rhetoric. We are more aware of the pump that the Vietnam War was giving to the economy from 1966 through the end of the decade. Most important, we are aware that the graph for the 1970s did not continue that steep downward sweep, but rather stopped short, that the figure reached in 1969 for blacks was about 1 percentage point from its poverty bottom. During the period following 1959, black progress against poverty among the working-aged coincided with the civil rights movement and with the general economic boom that began in the early 1960s. Progress stopped coincidentally with the implementation of the Great Society's social welfare reforms. This need not be accepted as evidence of causality. It must, however, be recognized as a statement of fact. Progress didn't really stop. The poverty measure is misleading. The official poverty statistic is based on gross cash income. What would happen if we were to include the dollar value of the in-kind assistance in income? What would happen if we were to take underreporting of income into account? What would happen if we were to take tax and Social Security liabilities into account? In other words, what would the poverty figure look like if we were to consider net income available for consumption spending? Timothy Smeating, then at the Institute for Research on Poverty, developed such an estimate, which I shall refer to as net poverty, the percentage of the population remaining beneath the poverty level after net income for consumption spending has been estimated. In the 50s, in-kind transfers were so small that we may assume the percentage of net poor was within a percentage point or two of the official figure. As late as 1968, the gap between official poverty and net poverty was still quite small, only 2.9 percentage points. The decreases in net poverty continued into the early 1970s. It was 1972 when progress on net poverty slowed, 2 years after the marked slowdown in the fall of official poverty. Thereafter, net poverty failed to sustain additional reductions. In 1979, net poverty stood at 6.1% of the population, compared with 6.2% in 1972, despite more than a doubling of real expenditures on in-kind assistance during the interim. Using net poverty as the measure changes the size of the baseline of persons living in poverty, but it does not change the nature of the puzzle. Huge increases in expenditures coincided with an end to progress. The most damning statistic, latent poverty. Imagine that the United States has decided to eliminate poverty among, say, Native Americans, and to that end it has put them all on reservations where there are no jobs to be had and has given everyone an income just above the poverty level. Can we claim to have eliminated poverty? In one sense, yes, the sense measured by the poverty statistic we have been using. But there would also be widespread outcry about the plight of the Indians because everybody on the reservation would be poor without government help. The latent poverty level, as I shall term it, is 100%. In 1964, when the War on Poverty began, almost all the emphasis was on eliminating poverty in this more fundamental sense of eliminating dependence on public assistance for a decent standard of living. Kennedy and Johnson alike wanted to eliminate the need for a dole. The official poverty statistic does not measure progress toward this goal, a fact that has not been brought to the fore in public debate of progress against poverty. The official measure has nothing to do with the ability of people to make a living for themselves. I therefore ask, what is the number of poor before the governmental transfers are taken into account? This population constitutes the latent poor. It has been determined by subtracting all government payments from total reported income in the March Current Population Survey of the Bureau of the Census, then comparing the remaining income with the poverty level. 10. Thus the latent poor include those who show up below the poverty level in the official measure, plus those who are above the poverty line in the official measure only by virtue of government support. The concept of latent poverty enables us to examine the dependent population in this country, those whom the Kennedy and Johnson initiatives started out to help in the first place. Figure 4.5 displays the trend line for latent poverty, with the official and net poverty figures drawn in for purposes of comparison. Latent poverty decreased during the 1950s from approximately a third of the population to 21% by 1965. Economic dependency decreased by about a third during the years 1950 to 65, up to the beginning of Johnson's War on Poverty. Increasing numbers of people had been able to make a living that put them above the poverty line. The proportion of latent poor continued to drop through 1968, when the percentage was calculated at 18.2. This proved to be the limit of progress. 3 Views of Poverty, 1950 to 1980. Sources: all figures are based on the March Current Population Survey conducted by the Bureau of the Census. Official poverty is the standard statistic published by the Bureau of the Census. See Appendix Table 5 for data and source information. Latent poverty figures for 1965 to 78 were taken from Sheldon Danziger and Robert Plotnick, The War on Income Poverty in Welfare Reform in America, edited by Paul M. Summers. Table 3.140. Latent poverty for 1980 was computed using the same procedures in a comparable database, as reported in Focus. Newsletter of the Institute for Research on Poverty, 7-2. Figures for net poverty are taken from Timothy M. Smeating, Recent Increase in Poverty in the U.S., What the Official Estimates Fail to Show. Figures for latent poverty and net poverty in 1950, 1955, and 1960 are estimated. See Note 11, Chapter 4. At some point during 1968 to 70, the percentage began to grow, reaching 19% in 1972, 21% in 1972. At some point, timing of the statistics is that economic independence, standing on one's own abilities and accomplishments, is of paramount importance in determining the quality of a family's life. Hardly anyone, from whatever part of the political spectrum, will disagree. For this independence to have decreased would be an indictment of the American system whenever in our history it might have occurred. For it to begin decreasing in 1968 to 70 was odd but perhaps attributable to the slowing of the boom. For it to have continued to decrease throughout the 70s was extraordinary. Lilt would have been worse otherwise. Once we have accepted that progress against poverty did in fact stop during the 1970s and, in the case of latent poverty, reversed, might there not be reason for thinking that things would have been much worse if the anti-poverty transfers had not been enacted? We may consider, for example, the huge influx of women and baby boom youths into the labor force during that period. From 1970 to 1980, the size of the total labor force increased by 24%, compared with a 13% increase from 1950 to 1960, and a 19% increase from 1960 to 197,013. Even a strong economy could not possibly absorb so many people, we hypothesize. The anti-poverty budget made up for those who were left out. This logic is coordinate with a variety of other hypotheses about the effects of changes in the economy that made it more difficult for people at the bottom of the ladder to get a start. There is surely some truth to such arguments. On the other hand, employers for the millions of new jobs that were created during the 1970s did not hang out signs reading "Poor people need not apply." What happened then to the acquisition of jobs by the poor and disadvantaged? We begin with unemployment and labor force participation, and some events of the 1960s that confounded traditional expectations of the job market. Summary of the federal effort. To each of the chapters in Part 2, I append a brief account of the legislation, court decisions, and executive actions that constituted the federal effort during the reform period. In the case of poverty, the scope of the federal effort to reduce poverty by means of income transfers dwarfs the rest of the programs we will consider. More accurately, it encompassed most of them and added other, very large programs as well. We will ignore for present purposes the jobs programs, equal employment efforts, and educational programs. On top of all these efforts was a huge expansion in the transfer of money and in-kind support. The principal components of the cash increases were expansions in public assistance, Social Security and its associated programs, unemployment insurance, and general welfare assistance in the form of supplemental security income. The eligibility rules for AFDC were liberalized first through the 1962 Social Security Amendments, then through changes in HUE administrative guidelines in the mid-60s, and finally by Supreme Court decisions. The size of the benefits kept increasing as well. Social Security was changed 5 times in the 1964 to 74 period. Eligibility rules were liberalized in a variety of ways, in the age limits for survivor benefits, in the amount of money that a person could earn without losing benefits, and the like. Congress passed across-the-board benefit increases of 7%, 13%, and 15%, and then, in 1972, it hitched Social Security benefits to the Consumer Price Index. Unemployment insurance was broadened to cover more persons and to last longer. The principal components of the in-kind transfers were Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, and housing programs. With the exception of Medicare, the in-kind transfers were means-tested. Eligibility depended essentially on income level. All except the housing programs were creations of the 1964 to 67 reform period. The trend line for total expenditures breaks naturally into halves, one slope for 1950 to 65, a distinctly steeper one for 1965 to 78. In 197,980, extremely high inflation leveled off real expenditures, even though expenditures in current dollars continued to climb. The magnitude of the expenditures requires some thinking about before they become real. Over $100 billion each year since the late 1960s. Over $200 billion annually since the mid-1970s. For an excellent summary of the expansions of the transfer programs, see Lawrence E. Lynn, Jr., A Decade of Policy Developments in the Income Maintenance System, in Robert H. Haveman, ed. A Decade of Federal Anti-Poverty Programs, Achievements, Failures, and Lessons, pp. 55 to